Hello, welcome to the channel. My name is Joseph Pith and this is the Pith Take. I went to school in the 1980s and early 90s. I felt kind of indifferent about the whole idea of school. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it. It wasn't something you could really get out of, so you just went. I was probably a middling student, maybe upper middling. I was the youngest in my school year, probably the smallest, definitely the quietest, and in the scheme of things, not exactly a popular kid. But despite that, amongst my particular social strata in school, I had a reasonable group of friends, and I would say I was probably well liked. Now, for the majority of my school life, the ethnic makeup of the town that I grew up in, which is Oldham in Lancashire, was around 95% white. Now, that's not a statistic I would have known at the time, but that's kind of mind-blowing, actually. Not quite as much as another statistic I read recently, which was about it was net foreign migration figures between 1951 and 1991, which I believe was about 3.5 million for the entire 40 years. Now net figures for 2024 for foreign migration were 700,000 for the year, so at that rate it'll be 5 years to match those figures from 51 to 91, and that's mental. Anyhow, inside and outside of school, really, my friend group was probably more like 80% white. So I guess in that respect, we were probably super diverse. Definitely was, statistically speaking. We had Indian friends, Pakistani friends, Afro-Caribbean friends, and they were no less tight-knit in our friend group than anyone else. And the thing of it is, it's not that we didn't see colour, which as a statement kind of annoys me, but more than that, it's just ridiculous. It's not that we didn't see colour, we just didn't care. But that's not to say there weren't ignorant, racist dickheads in the 80s and 90s. There were, but from my experience, they tended to be outliers and were largely kind of indoctrinated into that way of thinking. Then by the time the mid-90s rolled around, after leaving school, even those few loud morons had dwindled to like practically inaudible squeak. And that's because regular, decent people in the UK aren't ignorant and aren't bigoted. And so, for the main part, racism had become far less of a blot on society than it had been previously. Its coffin was 6 feet under. Nobody had attended the funeral, and we'd all spat on the obituary. Now, if anyone was actually watching these videos, I'm sure someone might comment and ask, something maybe like about Stephen Lawrence and his family. I'm sure they wouldn't agree that racism was dead and buried at that time. And well, no, obviously, of course they wouldn't. All I'm saying is that in general it was far less of a social ill than it had been for a very long time. Similarly, the family of Chris Donald would, I suspect, also disagree with me. You may not have heard of the case of Chris Donald. He was a 15-year-old boy in 2004 who was kidnapped off the streets of Glasgow, driven around for hours, and eventually stabbed multiple times, and as he bled to death from those injuries, he was doused in petrol and set on fire. And that was a Pakistani gang responsible for that, since charged. Tragically, there remains some absolute scum of the earth, knuckle-dragging, depraved half-wits of all colours and creeds. Now, through the 90s and the 2000s, I feel like we've become accustomed to, and maybe even a bit complacent of the idea that racism was, on the whole, just an ugly memory, and, its unmarked grave had been long forgotten in the arse end of nowhere. Now, little did we know that plans were afoot to exhume the grave, dust down the corpse, and puppeteer it like some sort of reanimated monster. I'm not pointing fingers in that regard, but I will say it definitely wasn't Gen X who were the useful idiots in that respect. As a generation, we were entrusted with this idea that had been championed by those who'd gone before us and had really begun to take root through their sweat, blood and tears. It was an idea that we embraced and established further, and ultimately grew to something that resembled a racially harmonious society, if you can believe it. But obviously that would never do, would it? So, alas, as Douglas Murray puts it so well, the train was just pulling into the destination station, only to pick up steam and go crashing off down the tracks. And now here we find ourselves, beset once more by noisy morons who insist on parading this vanquished spectre through streets and cities as if it hadn't ever gone away, really. And what are we supposed to do about that? That's the question. I'll see you in the next one.